So last week we kicked off a new series, a series that is focused on a man named David. Very key person that we find in the Old Testament. And so last week, having talked a bit about a woman named Hannah, having talked about the impact that she had in David's life, primarily as she had a son named Samuel, nurtured him, helped him grow in his faith. Having talked about Hannah last week, guess who we want to talk about this week? Her son, right? So now we're going to take a look at Samuel so that we might better understand the key role that Samuel played in David's life, the impact that Samuel had on David. Now, having said that, let me just set some context for you here, because this context is huge. You know, to be called by God, pretty great thing, and then you look at him and you think, well, that's not a good time to be called by God, and that's not a good thing to be asked to do at that particular time. So let's flesh that out to better understand it. At this point in Israel, as Hannah's son is growing, like growing into a young man, at this point, as our passage tells us, the word of the Lord is rare. So what does that mean? It simply means at that time, the people of God have become so sinful. The people of God have actually become so disinterested in God and in faith. They've come to that point where at that time in Israel, even Eli's sons, the priest we're going to talk about in this message today, at this point in Israel, God's people, they're not even trying to listen anymore. Picture that. And so here is Samuel in the midst of that, having not yet truly experienced God for himself. And we know that because in the passage we're about to read, it says, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, simply meaning God's voice hasn't fully come to him yet. God's presence hasn't really revealed itself to him yet. Here is Samuel in the midst of that, in his faith journey, in Israel's faith journey. Here is Samuel in the midst of that, moving from being an intern, right, working under the priest Eli. By the end of this passage, he now is the one God is calling to do what? To speak a word into a world that doesn't want to listen. Right? Some of you have faced that in personal relationships, in certain situations, but that's his context here. He moves from, okay, I'm working with Eli, to, okay, I'm the guy. God, I understand. You are calling me to speak a word to these people who don't want to listen. You're calling me in this moment to speak a word into this world that doesn't really care about God much anymore. That being our context, we turn today to 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 21. Long passage. I said last week, sometimes we deal with shorter passages. We're going to deal with longer ones in this series. This is so chock full of, though, so many things that we're going to dive into today. So if you want to follow along, 1 Samuel 3, verses 1 through 21, on your phones and your Bibles. 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 21. Here is God now beginning to reveal to Samuel, here's what I want to do through you. It says, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. That's what we were saying as we set this up, that at that time, very few people hearing God's voice, very few people sensing a word from God. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak they could barely see, he was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Enjoy this. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" But Eli said, "I didn't call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and he lay down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me?" "My son," Eli said, "I did not call, go back and lie down." Now Samuel, again, did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. It's why we're dealing with this kind of thing. A third time the Lord called Samuel. What do you think Samuel did? And Samuel got up and he went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, you called me." And this time Eli realized the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Man, I hope you think to say that throughout the day, right? When you just sense God in your life. Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other time, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle." That great image. "At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Can you imagine this? He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him, and I love this. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." He's saying, if it means punishing me, if that is the Lord's will, let him do what is good in his eyes. And now verses 19, 20, and 21. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. Man, may God bless these words from his word. May God bless these to us this day as we now journey into them. Now, once again, there are two very significant people that are a part of David's story even before he's born: Hannah and Samuel. And so last week, having learned from Hannah how we are to pray in the midst of despair, in the midst of hopelessness, and if you had to miss last week, I like to use that language because I know if you could have been a part of worship, of course you would have, right? But if you had to miss last week for some reason, go to beamer.org, listen into a bit of Hannah's story, her praying, what we learned from her. Having learned from Hannah last week how to pray in the midst of hopelessness, today we want to learn from Samuel as to what it takes to truly hear God's voice. In our passage today, that being our focus, here's some things that can really help us with that. Here's the first. First off, in order to more clearly hear God's voice in our lives, first off, in order to hear him better, we've got to do this. We've got to trust that God is always speaking to us, okay? We got to trust that no matter what, God is always speaking to us. And I'll tell you what that includes: when we don't think he is, right? When we can't hear him, when we feel like he's stopped speaking to us, what do we need to know beyond a doubt? God is always speaking to us. Grab onto that initially today. I think a first key thing that we find in this story is this very clear statement. The word of the Lord is rare. And again, what that means at its core is this. At that time, people are not sensing that God is speaking at all. Now, one conclusion we can draw from that is that God has stopped speaking. And I think it's important for us to say that out loud because that's a conclusion we can draw. That's an option we can draw. Someone can read this and say, well, isn't that terrible? Once in a while, God just stops talking to his people. That is one conclusion we can draw. That's one direction we can go. Or we can end up where we need to end up. You might have guessed that. Or we can end up here, where we know beyond a doubt that of course God is still speaking to them, right? Right now, for some reason, they're just not listening to him anymore. Guys, it's that latter thought that we really got to grab onto today. It's that second image that we got to make ours. And why is that? For this reason. Because at times in our lives today, we're going to get caught up in not being able to hear God, thinking he stopped speaking to us. And initially, if we can claim this thought, well, of course God is still speaking to them, then today when we feel like they were feeling, what's our default always going to be? I know he's talking to me. There's just something wrong with my listening, right? I know God is still speaking, not on him that I can't hear him. It's on me. One of the things that you've heard me say from time to time, I think I said it again today. If you've been around Beamer for a while, one of the things that I'll say periodically on a Sunday morning is this. Again, God, speak to us this day what we need to hear so that when we leave here, we'll know we've heard a word from you. And the reason that I say it in just that way isn't because, oh gosh, that's what I think I need to say before I preach. Instead, the reason I speak it in just that way is this. Because this is at the heart of our journey here at Beamer. Knowing that God is always talking to us, sometimes we're just not listening. Again, until Eli assures Samuel that it's God reaching out to him. Until Eli does that, even Samuel assumes can't be God's voice. So ask yourself first today, as you come alongside Samuel, ask yourself first today, do you in fact believe that daily God is speaking to you? I mean, do you truly believe that, such that when you're a part of this kind of worship experience, you know he's going to talk to you and you're going to hear a word from him? Or such that when you rise each day, no doubt in your mind, God's going to talk to you throughout the day, and thus you want to tune into that. God is always talking to you. Guys, knowing that even in this day, many people believe that God is silent, especially in the midst of that. Do you believe just the opposite and then live your life really based on that belief? Here's something else that we find here that can help us. Love this building on top of what we just said. Secondly, to hear God really, really well, we've also got to recognize this, that even while God is always speaking to us, this is also true. God is not speaking to us in a vacuum. God is not speaking to us in a void. Instead, claim this. God is always also speaking to us in a very specific context, okay? And that especially applies to Samuel in this passage. You know, often in the church, we'll read this passage we just read, and we'll think of this maybe as Samuel's call to faith. You know, maybe we'll think of this as his religious awakening. Or maybe even sometimes we'll think of this as his call to a certain role in building God's kingdom. And yet, while all of those things, I mean, they do fit here to some degree, even though that is true, man, here's the thing that we got to really pay attention to here, though. And I love how one scholar puts this. He writes this: God's call does not come to Samuel, nor does it come to us in general circumstances. Have you ever thought about this enough? This is not a narrative of Samuel's general spiritual awakening. It is not simply another experience on the road to his religious maturity. Instead, he writes, so great, Samuel is called by God in a time of spiritual desolation, religious corruption, political danger, and social upheaval. You want to be called into that, and yet he is. To add a little more flesh to that, let me read that again with some details. Again, he writes, Samuel is called by God in a time of spiritual desolation. The word of the Lord is rare. In a time of religious corruption, think of Eli and his sons. In a time of political danger, the Philistines are about to come against Israel. And it says also in a time of social upheaval, the question they face at that time is, do we even need a king? And if we do, who would it be? Guys, knowing that when we read that, here's what we begin to realize. This isn't just God saying to Samuel, Samuel, I need your help. Instead, this is God saying to Samuel, Samuel, I'm choosing you for such a time as this. Or to go even more deeply into that, this is God saying to Samuel, Samuel, I'm choosing you as the one who's going to speak this specific message into this specific context so that we might come to this specific result, come to this specific goal. Guys, here's why it's so important for us to notice that, because the very same thing applies to you and me. Again, claim that today. Every day when God is speaking to you, he's not trying to say to you in a general sense, I need your help. Instead, every day when God is speaking to you, and again, we claimed he's always speaking to you, but every day when he's speaking to you, instead, just like with Samuel, he's saying this to you. This is why it's so critical for us to listen. Every single day, God is actually saying this to you. Here's how I want to specifically use you in this specific context in your life in order to come to this specific result. Guys, knowing that, ask yourself secondly today, as we come alongside Samuel again, ask yourself secondly today, what is the current context into which God is speaking in your life right now? What is that? Struggle with that. Begin to define that. What is that context? Might be for some of you, God is speaking into the context of some conflict in your family, maybe. Maybe God is speaking in your life into the context of someone, a friend or a family member. They desperately need God, and you're sensing God kind of speaking into that context, perhaps providing you a word that you are to share. Very different than God saying, be faithful today. Maybe some of you would find God is speaking into a context in your life that involves ministry. Getting involved in ministry in a way that you haven't before. Children's ministry, worship ministry, some other ministry. But whatever it might be, as soon as possible, right? Not before you go to bed tonight, not sometime this week, not by the end of the month. As soon as possible, I want you to dive in and begin to define, oh Lord, this is the context into which you're speaking. Because man, if you can define that with God's help, it's going to make his word to you make more sense. It's going to help you better understand how he wants you to use that word. When I first arrived at Beamer almost 10 years ago, and we're going to try to party a little bit in 2 weeks. You know, I'm not the best. I don't know about the rest of you guys, it seems like we're not always the best at creating a party-like experience, but I'm going to try. I might at least have something. I love it how wives are looking at husbands. We are going to at least have something sweet to eat. But when we get to that first Sunday of July, while we will be competing with the 4th of July, and we won't skip that, it'll be 10 years. We'll look at kind of a 10th anniversary of us partnering together. I know God has led us to be together. But when I came to this place 10 years ago, this is what's really important for us all to remember. In any appointment, in any coming to a new church, when I first arrived, I didn't walk into a vacuum, did I? I didn't walk into a void. Instead, I was called into a very specific context, right? Dawns on me as I look at it, Josh, when he came here, very specific context. But as a pastor coming here, I was called into a very specific context. Further, when I arrived, I knew that this context didn't just need a pastor in general, right? I mean, it mattered who was coming because there was specific leadership that was needed because of that specific context. Man, that's not saying I've done it perfectly, but it's saying there were some things I could bring here. So what was the context? Kind of to lay this out a little bit. Some of you are going to remember a couple weeks ago, I talked about being at a workshop and 2 people from Beamer were there. And I knew that wasn't a coincidence. I knew immediately that I was coming into a context where there was some incredible lady, right? I also knew as I heard about things like Thrift House, as I heard about things like our tutoring program, as I heard about things like our youth ministry, our young adult ministry, strong traditional worship. We didn't have this at the time, but I knew there were some strengths in this context. I also knew this though. One person said to me very early on, not meaning to be negative, trying to lay out context, and I appreciated this. A key leader back then, still a key leader today. I wonder if she'll remember this, But somebody did say to me early on, we've kind of gotten to the point where we fear a little bit, will we be here 10 years from now, Meaning even though there is some strength, we got some things we got to work on. We got some things we got to fix, Did that bum me out? Did that make me think, woe is us? No. Context, right? Part of it. I knew when I got here, we had some financial struggles. We did, laid out a context. Again, rather than those things putting me off, they helped me to rejoice a bit because I believed that I could bring some specific skills into this specific context so that we could hit some specific results. Have we done it perfectly? Absolutely not. Have we hit all of them? No. In fact, maybe as an aside, every single year we got to sit down as leaders and say, okay, Lord, what's our context right now? Because it's not what it was then. And yet it also brings the strengths and the challenges. The one thing that helps us so much, though, some churches don't get into that, is just especially thinking context is important. Just thinking along those lines, it's helped us so much. Again, God speaks into a context in Samuel's life. What is that context in your life? And then here's a final thing that can help us to hear God better. Understanding this. Often a community is required when it comes to hearing God's voice. In other words, often it takes other people around us in order to hear the words that God really wants us to hear. Again, in our story today, and this is a lot of fun. In our story today, even though God is about to do an incredible thing in Samuel's life, remember, it says God's going to do something through him that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. Right? What a great image. Even though God is about to use Samuel in incredible ways, truly paving the way for David, even though that's the case, God is not able to do that, to get that moving without the help of Eli, right? This priest under whom Samuel is working. Because remember what it says in the passage. God speaks to Samuel not once, not twice, but 3 times. And yet even then, if it hadn't been for Eli saying to him, this is the Lord calling out to you, Had it not been for that, having someone alongside him in that way, Samuel might never have truly heard the word he needed to hear. Guys, in the very same way, we too at times find we're not receiving a word from God, not because he stopped speaking to come back around to where we started. Instead, at times, we don't hear him because in isolation, we can't. Bruce Birch writes, "This story reminds us that the divine word is often mediated through human words. In our efforts to discern God's will, we recognize in this story the need for community." Knowing that, ask yourself lastly today, how are you using the body of Christ? How are you using Christian community? How are you even just using the words of friends and family around you? How are you using those things in order to hear God's voice more clearly? And if your answer is you're not really tapping into the body in that way at all, then recognize the downside to that. Because truth is, with much of what God is trying to say to you today, community is crucial. 7 years ago here at Beamer, we were kicking off a small group movement, is the only way to describe it. I see a lot of you out there who are a part of that as we come through COVID, as we crank back up again. Boy, we need to get this going again, and we're working on that already. 7 years ago, we started 9 small groups, fall of 2014. Sarah and I were a part of one of those groups, meeting at the home of Stephen and Roberta Dreyer. There were 10 of us, some couples, some singles. But there were 10 of us gathered, and while we certainly grew in our faith together, we studied the Bible together. I mean, that was a part of what we did. But one of the most significant things we also did was this. At times, we tried to listen for God's voice in community. Best way to say it. Meaning at times, we would share with one another what was going on in our lives so that perhaps we could hear God's voice through one of those people around us. And I promise you, at times, exactly what I experienced. Again, how are other Christians a part of your hearing God's voice? And if not, fix that. If not, watch for some things that are about to start up. Next week, we're going to take a look at 3 more things that can help us. 3 more things we find in this passage. Be a part of this worship experience next week as we kind of finish out this part 1 and part 2. But for now, man, just work on these 3. For now, just embrace these 3 things we've learned, that more and more, you might hear God's word coming to you.